A billionaire finds twin sisters asleep in his stable. Days later, he returns home and is shocked. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning after the storm arrived gently, as if nature itself was apologizing for the chaos it had unleashed. A thin fog hovered over the Whitmore estate, wrapping the worn wooden fences and the sprawling fields in a shroud of silver. The old barn creaked softly under its own weight, its roof glistening with melted frost. Inside, the horses stirred, hooves shifting in the straw, snorting into the softened air. Harrison Whitmore stood at the kitchen sink of the main house, cradling a chipped mug of black coffee. He wore the same flannel shirt from the night before, sleeves rolled up, revealing the tanned, weathered skin of a man who had spent more years outdoors than in. His hands, though gnarled by time, moved with practiced ease as he cracked eggs into a hot skillet. Bacon sizzled beside them. He cooked like someone who rarely did, but remembered how. He glanced toward the barn, through the frosted window. The light from the upper loft was still on. Strange, he thought. He hadn't left it that way. Then he remembered Clara and Lena. Their faces returned to him in fragments, wide-eyed, drenched, too young to be this tired. He hadn't asked for their stories. They hadn't offered, but something in him had known to let them stay. A soft knock at the back door pulled him from his thoughts. Lena stood there, still wearing the oversized coat Hyde lent her. It dwarfed her small frame. Her hair, damp and tangled the night before, was now tied back in a low braid. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," she said. "Morning," Harrison replied, stepping aside. Come in. You hungry?" She nodded, shyly. "Come in. You hungry?" "Is it okay if Clara comes in too? She's just making sure the horses are all right." "That's more than Michael usually does," Harrison muttered, motioning her to sit. "Tell your sister breakfast on in 5. By the time Clara joined them, the kitchen was warm with the smell of food and the quiet clatter of mismatched plates. She held her shoulders straighter than Lena, but her eyes were just as wary. Harrison watched them eat with a patience he didn't know he still had. They were careful with their words, polite, grateful, too grateful. He noticed the way Clara glanced around the kitchen, taking in every exit, every shadow. Lena jumped when a bird hit the window. He didn't press them. Instead, he spoke of mundane things. The storm, the damage to the fence line, the fact that Silver Comet had finally stopped biting at his stall door. It was Lena who asked, between bites of toast, "Is that the big gray horse with the scar on his flank?" "That be him," Harrison said, surprised. "You know horses?" Clara looked at her sister, a silent exchange passing between them. Then she nodded. "Our mom used to train them before a lot of things." "Must have been good," Harrison said softly. "Not many people get that close to Comet. He's picky." "He's picky." The girls said nothing, but their silence was filled with something that felt like history. After breakfast, Harrison offered them the guest room above the tack shed. Nothing fancy, but dry, warm, and private. They hesitated. Clara, more than Lena. "It ain't charity," he said. "It's common sense. There's more room here than I know what to do with." Finally, they accepted. Clara insisted on helping with chores in return. Harrison didn't argue. That afternoon, while inspecting the wind-damaged paddock, he watched from a distance as Clara walked the fence line with a coil of wire over her shoulder. Lena swept the barn aisle with short, sure strokes, humming under her breath. The horses seemed calmer around them, as if recognizing something kindred. As twilight set in, Harrison found himself sitting on the porch, an old wool blanket over his knees, watching the chimney smoke rise. The wind had died. A robin landed on the rail and chirped, startled by the quiet. He thought of his son, Gabriel, of Eleanor Foster, of letters never sent. He thought of how silence could stretch between people, making strangers out of kin. Inside, Clara and Lena were reading in the living room, their figures bathed in the amber glow of a floor lamp. Lena had curled up in the corner of the couch with a volume of Whitman's poems. Clara sat straighter, more guarded, paging through a veterinary manual as if it were scripture. Harrison listened to the creak of the house, to the old boards speaking truths only time understood. Maybe, just maybe, the storm hadn't only brought rain and wind. Maybe it had brought a beginning. As he reached to turn off the porch light, Harrison paused. Then he left it on. The third morning broke in quiet hues of frost and gold. Harrison Whitmore stirred his coffee absently at the kitchen table, his eyes trained on the frost-dusted paddocks just beyond the window. Outside, the horses milled about in the stillness of morning, their breath visible in the crisp air. But it wasn't the horses he was watching. Not really. It was Clara. She moved like someone who belonged there, every motion purposeful, her body reading the animals like second nature. Lena, a few yards behind, struggled with a reluctant bay colt, but Clara stepped in silently, placing her hand gently on the colt's neck. The horse calmed almost instantly. Harrison felt a familiar pang in his chest, the same kind he used to feel when watching Eleanor Foster work the ring. Eleanor. That name had not been uttered on Whitmore soil in over 2 decades, and yet it lived now in every whisper of movement from those girls, especially Clara, her way of tilting her head, the quiet confidence. There were things you couldn't teach about horses. They had to be inherited. He finished his coffee in silence. Later that morning, he found them in the lower barn, sweeping out stalls without being asked. They worked without fanfare, as though the rhythm of hay and hoof had always belonged to them. "You girls worked with horses before?" he asked, leaning against the barn post. Clara looked up, her hands still moving. "Things fell apart after our mother passed." He nodded slowly, not pushing, but the answer hovered in the air like steam off warm hay. After a pause, he added, "Fosters? Not a name you hear often. You related to Eleanor Foster by chance?" Clara's hand stilled. She didn't look at him right away. Instead, she picked up a handful of straw and placed it into the feeder, methodical. Only the horses shifted and breathed. Harrison took a slow step inside the barn. His boots crunched on the packed earth. "Your mother trained here, long before either of you were born. She was remarkable." "We know," Clara said finally, turning toward him. Her voice was firm but not cold. She never spoke much about this place, only that it ended badly. He sighed. It did, not because of her. That afternoon, Harrison retreated to the old study in the West Wing, a room heavy with dust and forgotten sunbeams. He hadn't been in there for years, but the desk drawers still creaked the same. He dug until he found it, a faded photograph tucked inside a leather-bound journal. Eleanor standing beside her prize mare, Morning Ember. She looked no older than Clara did now. Her eyes, intelligent and watchful, her smile, rare but sincere. He stared at the photo until his hand trembled. That night, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the old wooden floors. Clara sat curled on the couch, Lena on the rug with a mug of tea. Harrison lowered himself into the armchair slowly, the photograph in hand. He held it out. Clara took it carefully. Her fingers brushed the edge of the image like it might disappear. "That's her," she said softly. "She trained that horse from birth. Morning Ember. Most people said it couldn't be done. She proved them wrong." Clara studied the photo like it held a secret she hadn't yet unlocked. Lena leaned in, her eyes wide. "Why did she leave?" Clara asked. The fire popped in the hearth. She didn't leave, Harrison said. She believed in kindness, in reading the horses rather than breaking them. He said she was soft, weak, but she wasn't. He paused. When she tried to expose what he was doing, she found herself blamed for a scandal that wasn't hers. Clara looked up sharply. What kind of scandal? Harrison hesitated, then shook his head. That's a longer story. But it hurt her, and it hurt this place. My father made sure she couldn't find work in horses again. Lena whispered. She never told us any of that. I imagine she wouldn't. She was proud. She left to protect something. They sat in silence then, the weight of generations settling like dust. Before he turned in for the night, Harrison paused at the stairs. You girls are welcome to stay, not because of your mother, because of who you are. Clara nodded. Thank you. As Harrison ascended the stairs, he carried the photo of Eleanor with him. That night, for the first time in years, he placed it on the bedside table, and when he turned off the light, he dreamed of morning ember galloping across open fields, and a young woman's laughter echoing in the wind. A name, once buried, was stirring again, not as a ghost, but as a beginning. The morning after the attic discovery was quiet, almost deceptively so. Lena hadn't slept. The journal pages still felt warm in her hands, as if Gabriel's voice had been whispering to her all night. Clara, normally the early riser, remained in bed longer than usual, turned toward the window where frost traced delicate vines on the glass. Downstairs, the hearth was already glowing. Harrison sat in his worn armchair, a mug of black coffee trembling slightly in his hands. The house felt different now. Not because anything had changed physically, but because something long buried had begun to shift. Memories had stirred. Ghosts, once silent, now paced the corridors. Lena came down the stairs holding a bundle of the attic's contents. Yellowed letters wrapped in twine, a faded photograph of a young woman with dark curls holding the reins of a bay stallion, and the journal. Harrison looked up slowly, his eyes falling not on the papers but on Lena herself. Where did you find those? He asked, voice low, as if afraid it might shatter. In a cedar box under the floorboards, Lena replied gently. Behind the old crate. Someone went to a lot of trouble to keep them out of sight. Harrison said nothing. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind picked up and brushed snow against the windows like a long-forgotten knock. Lena took a tentative step forward. Do you want me to read it to you? He hesitated, then nodded. She began with the first entry dated March 1985. I don't know who to trust anymore. The man who raised me might be my father. Eleanor says it was all a lie, that Maximilian planned it years ago. There was a fire last week. They say it was accidental. I don't believe them. As Lena read, Harrison's posture slowly changed. His back, once rigid, sagged slightly. His hand moved from the coffee mug to the armrest, gripping it tightly. I remember that fire, he said. We lost 3 horses, and something else. Lena stopped reading. You stopped reading? Your son was scared. He was trying to protect something. Someone. Clara appeared in the doorway, wrapped in an old quilt. Or he was protecting the truth, she added softly. Harrison looked at the girls, his jaw working through years of held-back words. Gabriel was strong, but he was fighting forces I didn't understand until it was too late. And Eleanor, he trailed off, then turned to look at the photograph Lena had set beside the journal. His fingers brushed the edges. She was lightning in a bottle. They sat in silence. Then Lena gently handed him the letters. Most of them were addressed to you, unopened. He stared at the names scrawled across the envelopes. His own handwriting, his own fears, sealed and buried. He opened one with shaking hands. Dad, I need you to believe me. I need you to know that I didn't run. I was sent away. There are things you don't know, things I couldn't tell you. But they matter, and they're coming back. Please, don't forget me. Gabriel. Harrison folded the letter carefully and pressed it against his chest. Clara reached over and took his hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Then came the knock at the door. Not frantic, not desperate, just steady. Lena looked at Clara. Harrison slowly rose to his feet. When he opened the door, a gust of wind blew in a flurry of snow, and the figure of a woman in a weather-worn coat, her face hidden beneath a knit cap and scarf. She removed her scarf slowly. Harrison staggered back, his hand going to the doorframe for support. Eleanor, her eyes dark and tired but still fierce, met his. "It's been a long time, Harry." Behind him, Clara and Lena stood frozen. The woman stepped inside. She looked around as if expecting everything to be just as she left it. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here," she said, brushing snow off her coat. "I never left," Harrison replied, his voice catching. "But you did," she nodded. "Because I had to. Because Gabriel asked me to." Lena stepped forward. "You knew him?" Eleanor turned, her gaze softening as she took in the two girls. "I didn't just know him. I loved him, like a son, like more than that." She pulled a small bundle from her coat, another stack of letters, older than the ones from the attic, bound in a red ribbon. "I kept these all these years. Letters he wrote to you. To the estate, to a future he didn't think he'd ever reach." Harrison gestured toward the living room. They sat by the fire, the warmth a small mercy in the midst of unraveling memories. Eleanor leaned forward. The night of the fire, Gabriel found something. He was going to expose it. Records hidden in Maximilian's ledgers, birth documents, payment logs. He said he was going to tell you. But before he could, he disappeared, Harrison finished. "They told me he ran off, that he was angry, unstable." "He was terrified," Eleanor whispered. "But not for himself, for them." She looked at Lena and Clara. A silence filled the room, not empty, but weighted with realization. Clara's fingers curled tightly around the edge of her quilt. Lena's breath hitched in her throat. "You knew our father," Lena said. Eleanor nodded. "I helped him protect what mattered most." She pulled a faded photograph from the bundle and handed it to Harrison. It showed Gabriel in the stables, holding a newborn foal, and standing beside him, Eleanor, younger, vibrant. And in her arms, two swaddled infants. "They said it was too dangerous to keep them here," Eleanor said. "So we left. We started over. That you can't outrun blood or memory. I had to come back. I had to give you the truth." Harrison couldn't speak. He looked from the photograph to the girls, then to Eleanor. The fire popped in the hearth. "I lost my son," he finally whispered. "No," Eleanor replied, her voice firm. "You just didn't know you had daughters." And in the stillness that followed, something fragile and sacred began to mend. Outside, the wind softened. Snow fell quietly, like grace. Inside, 3 generations sat together by the fire, the past meeting the present, and the future slowly beginning to unfold. The morning after Eleanor's return dawned gray and hesitant, as if the clouds above the Whitmore estate still mulled over whether they should weep or hold their peace. Harrison sat at the long oak dining table, a black-and-white photo trembling slightly between his fingers. In the faded image, Magnus Whitmore stood beside a young Randall Kane, both men dressed impeccably, their smiles too polished to be sincere. Behind them stood a stallion that would later bring the family both acclaim and ruin. Clara and Lena moved quietly in the background, preparing breakfast as if their presence had always belonged here. The air smelled of fresh coffee and toast, but Harrison tasted only ashes. He was always a quiet man. Harrison murmured, finally breaking the silence. Clara looked up. Randall. Harrison nodded. Too quiet. Especially for someone who worked with horses. They usually draw stories out of a man. But Randall. He held his close. Eleanor, seated at the far end of the table, looked older this morning. Her eyes, red from sleeplessness, held a storm of regret. He did what Magnus told him, she said flatly. That doesn't excuse it. But it explains it. Harrison turned. Did you know? Eleanor looked away, her voice barely audible. Not until it was too late. And by then, Randall had already disappeared from the estate. The creak of the back door announced Lena's quiet departure. She needed space. The barn had become her sanctuary. Outside, the frost hadn't yet melted. Lena ran a hand over the flank of Midnight Echo, the estate's remaining descendant of the infamous bloodline. The horse turned, eyes soft and searching, and Lena leaned her forehead against his. You remember him, don't you? Gabriel! She didn't expect an answer, but in that moment of stillness she felt something shift. Not in the barn, in her. Back inside, Eleanor had produced a small box from her coat. She placed it before Harrison. Randall gave this to me years ago before he left. Told me to give it to you if the truth ever came knocking. Harrison opened the lid slowly. Inside were 3 items: a pocket watch, a brass key, and a yellowed envelope addressed in Magnus's handwriting. The key opens the ledger room, Harrison said with grim recognition. My father kept records of everything. Horses, competitions, payments. But I always believed they were about business, not crime. You didn't want to see it, Eleanor replied gently. No, he agreed, voice hollow. I didn't. In the afternoon, they walked together to the small brick building at the edge of the estate, the old office Magnus had used. Harrison inserted the key. The door creaked open. Dust motes floated in the sunbeam from a cracked window. Shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound ledgers, each labeled meticulously by year. Harrison reached for the one marked 1995, the year Gabriel died. Clara and Lena joined them, standing silently as Harrison flipped through pages of numbers, codes, and strange initials. What are we looking for exactly? Clara asked. Patterns, Eleanor whispered. Cross-references, names that show up in the wrong places. They found them. Payments made to men who had no official role in the estate. Transfers listed under show horse names that never competed. And one entry, scribbled hastily in the margin, R.C. Infant exchange completed. Under Magnus's instruction, Harrison closed the book. His hands shook. Gabriel never knew, he said. He died thinking his son would inherit everything, that it would be just. Lena stepped forward. But it wasn't. Harrison looked at her. The afternoon light caught her features in a way that stole his breath. Not because of her resemblance to Gabriel, though it was uncanny, but because of the dignity she carried. The same quiet fire. No, he said, but maybe now it can be. Later that evening, as the fireplace crackled with a reluctant warmth, Eleanor confessed something else. Randall wrote me once, years after he left, said he regretted it, that he thought of the boy, of both boys, every day. He died in Montana, cancer, alone. There was a pause. Then Harrison spoke. He wasn't the only one who died alone. We all did, in some way. That fire didn't just take Gabriel. It took everything we believed about who we were. Lena stood and crossed the room, placing a hand on his shoulder. Then maybe it's time to start over. Not with bloodlines, with truth. Outside, the first snow began to fall again, quiet and slow. In the barn, midnight echo let out a low nicker, a sound not of fear, but of recognition. A sound that echoed across generations, through secrets, grief, and now, through healing. Harrison closed the ledger room that night with a different lock, not to hide it away again, but to keep it safe. Because the truth, once freed, had become sacred. Morning broke gently over the Whitmore estate, sunlight streaming through the ancient oaks and bathing the fields in a warm golden hue. Harrison Whitmore stood on the porch, a mug of black coffee cradled in his weathered hands, his gaze fixed on the horses grazing in the paddock. But his thoughts were far from the peaceful scene before him. His mind churned with memories and newly uncovered truths. Clara and Lena, the two young women he'd taken in, moved through the stables with a quiet grace, tending to the horses with uncanny skill. Their presence had brought life back to the old estate, but also stirred shadows Harrison had long buried. Inside the library, Evan Whitmore, Harrison's grandson by love, not blood, sat at the desk surrounded by piles of old papers, letters, journals, and legal documents. The truth had settled heavily in his chest. He wasn't a Whitmore by blood. He thought of his childhood, long afternoons on horseback with Harrison, the stories told by the fire, the pride in his grandfather's eyes. It all felt like it was slipping away, and yet he knew in his bones that none of it had been a lie. The love was real. By afternoon, Evan couldn't hold it in any longer. He found Harrison in the barn, brushing Midnight, the prized stallion who had survived storms both real and metaphorical. "Harrison," Evan began, voice rough, "we need to talk." Harrison turned slowly. His deep blue eyes searched Evan's face. "I know," he said softly. "I've been meaning to talk too." They sat together on an old wooden bench outside the barn. The breeze carried the scent of hay and earth. I read the documents, Evan said, eyes on the ground. "I know I'm not your real grandson." Harrison sighed, placing a steady hand on Evan's shoulder. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I thought I was protecting you." "I get that," Evan nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. "And I know now that what we have, what you gave me, is real. But I also know I need to do something to make it right." "You already are," Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've become a better man than I could have hoped." In the days that followed, Evan, Clara, and Lena worked side by side to investigate the extent of Magnus Whitmore's crimes. Money laundering, masked as elite horse competitions, falsified bloodlines, and, worst of all, the switching of children to protect a criminal legacy. Evan offered everything to the authorities: records, financial ledgers, even his own testimony. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. As they delved deeper, Evan and Clara grew closer. Their late-night talks turned to laughter. Shared pain became shared strength. Lena, ever the optimist, kept them both grounded. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Harrison gathered them around the fireplace. "I know our past is filled with mistakes," he said, eyes scanning the faces of the young people before him. "But watching the three of you now, I have hope again." Clara took Harrison's hand, eyes shining. "We're a family, Harrison." "Maybe not by blood, but where it matters." Evan nodded. "We'll rebuild this place together, for justice and for love." Harrison smiled, a quiet peace settling over him. The weight he'd carried alone for so long was now shared, and lighter for it. Outside, the stars began to scatter across the sky, watching over a new kind of family, one bound not by lineage but by loyalty, healing, and the decision to carry forward only the best parts of the past. The smell of smoke still lingered long after the fire trucks had gone. It clung to the walls of the manor, seeped into the creases of Harrison Whitmore's clothes, and curled like a ghost around the remnants of the once mighty stable. The fire had taken with it a lifetime of memories, but it had also unearthed something even more powerful than loss: truth. It was Lena who had found the birth certificate in the rubble, its edges singed, but the names unmistakable. Gabriel Whitmore and Eleanor Foster as parents. Clara had stood beside her, soot-streaked and trembling, as if the page in her sister's hand was made of fire itself. They hadn't spoken at first. The wind had howled through the broken beams of the stable, and the stallion, Silver Comet, safe in the paddock, had nickered as if sensing that the world had just tilted. It was Harrison who finally broke the silence. "Let me see it," he said gently, holding out his hand. Lena passed it to him without a word. Harrison studied the page beneath the flickering light of a temporary work lantern, his weathered face unreadable. Then his eyes closed. "Gabriel, you were trying to tell me all this time," he whispered, voice hoarse. "I didn't want to see it. I was too afraid." Clara knelt beside him. "You didn't know, Harrison." "No," he said, opening his eyes to look at her. "No," he said, opening his eyes to look at her. "But I should have. You look like him. Both of you do. Not just in the eyes, but in the way you carry yourselves. The way you handled the fire tonight. That was Gabriel, through and through." He handed the paper back with shaking fingers. "You are my granddaughters. I don't care how late I came to know it. You are." Lena and Clara didn't cry, though the weight of those words landed like an avalanche. Instead, they reached for Harrison together, arms wrapping around the old man who had opened his barn, and now his heart to them. In the days that followed, the Whitmore estate became a hive of quiet restoration. What was left of the stable was cleared out. Volunteers from town came to help rebuild. Neighbors who hadn't set foot on the property in years now brought sandwiches, tools, and stories. Clara took charge of coordinating the rebuild, her background in veterinary studies proving invaluable. Lena handled the estate's finances with the steady hand of someone used to surviving on little and making it stretch. Evan worked alongside them both, his role no longer rooted in bloodlines but in choice. At night, they sat together in the parlor, reading Gabriel's journals, listening to Eleanor recount the past, her disappearance, the lies spun by Magnus, the decisions made out of fear and love. Eleanor had grown thin, her health waning, but her spirit was steady. "I stayed away because I thought it would keep you safe," she told her daughters one evening. "But I realize now, keeping truth away only makes the darkness grow." It was Clara who reached for her hand. "You came back. That's what matters." And it did. The girls didn't carry blame, only longing, only the hunger to know where they came from and what it meant. Now, they were learning, and they were healing, and they were healing. Harrison, once stoic and distant, now sat with a softness that surprised even him. He found himself speaking of Gabriel, not as the son who disappointed him, but as the son he hadn't understood. "He had a gift," Harrison murmured one morning, watching Clara lead Silver Comet through the paddock. "He saw things in people that I couldn't. In horses, too. The new stable rose steadily, beam by beam." A plaque was planned to go above its entrance, in memory of Gabriel Whitmore, for the love that endures. On the morning of the dedication, townspeople gathered in quiet reverence. Clara and Lena stood in matching navy coats, their hair pulled back, their eyes shining with emotion. Harrison stood between them, cane in hand, shoulders straighter than they had been in years. "This place was built on pride," he said to the crowd. "But pride alone doesn't carry you through the storms. Love does. Truth does. And it took a fire for me to see that." He turned to the girls. "They are Whitmores. They are Whitmore. Not because of this land or the name, but because of the strength in their hearts." Clara stepped forward, voice clear. "We're proud of our father and of our mother. We honor what was taken from them by building something better." The crowd applauded, and in that moment, under the crisp sky and the scent of hay and wood, the past didn't vanish. It became part of the foundation. Later, as twilight painted the fields in gold and violet, Harrison sat on the porch, Silver Comet grazing nearby. Clara joined him, a mug of tea in her hands. "You know," he said quietly, "I never thought I'd live to see this place reborn, but it feels like something sacred is beginning." Clara nodded. "Maybe it took everything falling apart to show us how to build it right." He looked at her then, really looked, at the strength in her jaw, the tenderness in her gaze, the light of her mother's fire and her father's soul. "You're going to do great things, Clara. Both of you are. And this old place will stand," she finished for him, smiling. "Not as a monument to what was, but to what we chose." In the distance, Lena was laughing with Evan. The sound drifted across the field like music. The night settled gently over the estate, and with it, a peace that Harrison hadn't felt in decades. The fire had taken much, but from its ashes, something beautiful had risen, a family, and a legacy worth fighting for. The hammering stopped only when the last board was set into place. Harrison Whitmore stood back, his hand resting on the new cedar beam, the scent of fresh wood mingling with the faint memory of ash. The stable, once a graveyard of buried truths and shattered trust, now stood proud and new, a sanctuary rising from ruin. Clara watched him from across the paddock, her hands dusty and blistered, the sleeves of her flannel shirt rolled up past her elbows. Lena stood beside her, brushing Silver Comet, the stallion who had come to symbolize far more than lineage or prestige. He had survived the fire. They all had, in one way or another. The Eleanor Center for Equine Healing was nearly complete. Where once wealthy investors paraded polished thoroughbreds for trophies, now weathered veterans, troubled teens, and grieving families would learn the language of horses and healing. The transformation of the Whitmore estate was not merely architectural. It was spiritual. Inside the new barn office, Evan crouched over blueprints, his brow furrowed in concentration. Once he had thought his identity hinged on the Whitmore name. Now he found purpose not in blood, but in rebuilding what that name could mean. Clara entered quietly, placing a cup of coffee by his elbow. Then, glancing at her, he added, "The framing on the north wing needs adjustment. You and Lena okay to handle it?" She nodded. "We've got it." Silver Comet's stall needs a little reinforcement anyway. Their exchange was easy, honest. What once had been guarded now flowed freely, a quiet rhythm of shared labor and trust. Outside, Eleanor sat beneath the willow tree she had planted decades ago, before everything had gone wrong. She read aloud to a small group of children visiting the center, her voice soft but steady. Lena lingered nearby, listening. It struck her how different her aunt seemed now, no longer the haunted figure from that first shocking morning, but someone slowly coming home to herself. At supper that evening, the long table on the veranda buzzed with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Fresh cornbread, grilled vegetables, and Clara's blackberry cobbler filled the table. Harrison, seated at the head, raised a hand for quiet. "I never imagined this place would be more than it was," he said, voice gravelly but sure. But you made it more. You all did. Lena reached for Clara's hand under the table. Across from them, Evan gave a small nod, and Eleanor, eyes glistening, smiled through her tears. That night, Harrison returned to the stable alone. The moonlight spilled through the windows like memory itself. He walked to Silver Comet's stall, resting a hand on the horse's neck. The animal nickered softly. "Thank you for staying," Harrison whispered. He turned, his gaze falling on a framed photo newly hung on the stable wall. It was Gabriel, smiling in the saddle, Lena and Clara flanking him. A photo edited by time and truth, yet somehow more real than anything he had allowed himself to see before. Footsteps approached. It was Eleanor, her silhouette still graceful despite the years. "You never talk about him," she said gently. "I didn't know how," Harrison replied. They stood in silence for a moment, until Eleanor reached up and adjusted the frame slightly. "Now you can." The next morning brought visitors, a van from the local VI clinic, a school counselor from the nearby town, a mother and her son, still hollow-eyed from recent loss. Harrison watched Clara and Lena greet them, not as heirs or heroes, but as people who understood the shape of pain and how horses could trace a path through it. The land seemed to breathe again, not with the weight of secrets, but with the promise of purpose. The wind through the paddocks carried not the scent of smoke, but of hay and hope. And just before dusk, when the sky turned lavender and gold, Evan hoisted the new sign onto the front gate. He stepped back, dusted off his hands, and read it aloud. The Eleanor Center for Equine Healing below it, in smaller letters, where hearts and hooves learn to trust again. Harrison placed a hand on Evan's shoulder. No words, just the quiet, enduring language of forgiveness. There would be more hard days, more repairs both seen and unseen. But for the first time in a long while, they weren't bracing for storms. They were building toward the light. The courtroom in Willow Ridge County had never held so many cameras, nor so many hearts perched on the edge of silent hope. The Whitmore case was no longer just a family reckoning. It had become a town's reckoning, and maybe, in some quiet way, a nation's as well. A reckoning with how power hides behind polished boots and pearl-buttoned collars. Harrison Whitmore sat in the front row, hands folded in his lap, his back straighter than it had been in years. To his left was Clara, to his right Lena. Eleanor, a pillar of grace despite her cane and aging bones, rested a gloved hand over his. Behind them sat Evan, calm but watchful, guarding not just them but the truth they'd all fought to unearth. The judge was a woman named Ruth Ellison, gray-haired but sharp-eyed, with a reputation for fairness and no tolerance for pretense. She had presided over cases of embezzlement and elder abuse, but this was different. This trial was about memory, about legacy, about the weight of a name that had once stood for excellence and had been corrupted by secrecy. Randall Kane was the first to testify. The former stable master, his once proud frame now bent and tremulous, took the stand in an ill-fitting suit, his eyes sunken, but still holding fragments of defiance. "Yes," he said, voice cracking, "I was the one who placed the child, Evan, into Harrison's arms. I followed Magnus's orders. I thought I was protecting the family, but I see now. I was preserving a lie." Harrison didn't flinch. He had known. But hearing it said aloud in public peeled away one more layer of shame. Clara watched Randall with a face that was both stone and storm. Lena's hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Next came the digital evidence, Olivia Whitmore's voice, preserved in a recovered voicemail from years ago. If you're hearing this, it means the truth finally matters more than protection. Magnus orchestrated everything. I kept silent for too long. Gabriel knew, and it cost him. I'm sorry. Eleanor's journal, read by the prosecution, painted in painful detail how she and Beatrice Foster had tried to stop Magnus's laundering scheme through falsified horse competitions. How they'd uncovered bank accounts, phony registries, swapped DNA reports. How the fire that had claimed so much had been no accident. The defense attempted to discredit the testimonies, to challenge the authenticity of the documents, to paint Magnus as a man whose methods, though questionable, were for the good of the family. What good is a family built on fraud? Evans said when asked why he stayed. What good is a name if it buries the truth beneath it? When he spoke, the courtroom fell silent. Here was the man who had grown up as a Whitmore, who had held the family name as tightly as a lifeline, now choosing something harder, honesty. In a powerful moment, Lena took the stand. Her voice shook at first, but then it steadied like a rider finding rhythm in a gallop. "We didn't come here to take revenge," she said, eyes scanning the room. "We came to bring light, because truth shouldn't rot in attics. It should breathe, even if it breaks hearts along the way." The trial lasted 9 days. In the end, the court found Randall guilty of obstruction of justice. Several of Magnus's surviving associates were indicted on conspiracy and financial crimes. A portion of the Whitmore estate, as dictated in Eleanor's amended will, was to be used for community restoration and the expansion of the Eleanor Center for Equine Healing. Harrison declined to speak on the courthouse steps, but later that night, back on the porch overlooking the rebuilt barn, he raised a glass of sweet tea to the stars. "To Gabriel," he whispered, "and to all the truths that took too long to come home." Clara and Lena joined him, sitting close, silent but present. Evan came too, holding the old family photo with Gabriel in it. The real father, the true thread that tied them all together. The Whitmore name would no longer stand for silence, not after all this, and not ever again. The morning the Foster Whitmore Foundation opened its doors, dew still clung to the paddock fences, and a hush blanketed the rolling fields of the Whitmore estate. The world outside remained unaware that something extraordinary was quietly beginning. Horses ambled lazily in their pastures, their breath visible in the cool spring air. Inside the newly built barn, Clara stood beside Lena, both women holding mugs of coffee, their fingers tight around the warmth. "It doesn't feel real yet," Lena whispered. Clara nodded. "Not yet, but it will." Not yet." They had envisioned this place through the ashes, not just of the burned stable, but of old secrets, long-held griefs, and names that once bore only burden. Now, they were creating something that pointed toward light, not to erase the past, but to redeem it. Veterans had already started arriving. So had children from shelters, some of them too young to speak their pain, others who had learned silence as protection. A teenage girl named Melody was the first to approach a horse without trembling. A combat veteran named Thomas wept openly when Silver Comet, the once injured stallion, allowed him to lay a hand on his neck. "These horses, they don't judge me," Thomas had said. "They just listen." That was the idea. Healing wasn't luck. It wasn't always triumphant. Sometimes it was just a hand on a warm flank, a steady breath, a moment of connection too profound to name. Harrison watched all of it from the porch, wrapped in his woolen shawl, cane at his side. Age had curved his spine but sharpened his clarity. He saw in each rider's eyes a reflection of his younger self, wounded, guarded, and longing for something honest. "Your father would be proud," Eleanor said, easing into the rocker beside him. He gave a sad smile. "I hope so. I failed him." "No," she said softly. You forgave him, and that's a rarer thing. Down by the fence line, Evan was helping a boy adjust a saddle. He laughed when the boy made a joke about horse poop, and something about that laugh, unguarded, genuine, made Harrison's throat tighten. Later that day, the foundation hosted its first gathering. Local townspeople came bearing casseroles and hand-stitched quilts. A retired judge, who had once presided over Magnus's hearings, offered a quiet donation and a word of thanks. Clara stood in front of the gathered crowd, voice steady, eyes wet. "This place is built on broken pieces," she said. "But sometimes what's broken lets light through. My sister and I never imagined coming back to this land, to this name. But life has a way of leading us home, even when that home was once lost." A breeze stirred the tall grass. A hawk circled overhead. Lena took Clara's hand. "We are not here to erase what happened. We are here to honor what survived it." The applause was gentle but true, the kind born of understanding, not obligation. That night, they lit lanterns and placed them along the riding trails. Each one carried a name: Gabriel, Olivia, Eleanor, Nicholas, even Magnus. Not to glorify, but to recognize. To hold the truth without letting it define the future. In her room, Clara sat writing letters to donors and reading through stories submitted by participants. One was from Melody, who had found the courage to speak of her father's abuse. Another came from Thomas, now volunteering weekly and guiding others through their healing. The next morning, as dawn painted the barn in golden light, a group of children gathered to meet the horses. Silver Comet stood proud, his coat glinting. Lena knelt beside a girl with hearing loss, guiding her hand gently to the horse's muzzle. In that moment, Clara understood. Legacy wasn't built in courtrooms or through bloodlines. It was built in these seconds of trust, in eye contact. In the stillness between heartbeats, a new chapter had begun. And this one would be written with open hands, full hearts and feet rooted in soil that remembered everything, but held nothing back. The Foster Whitmore Foundation wasn't just a tribute. It was a living promise. Autumn arrived gently in the valley, its golden hush spilling across the fields where leaves whispered in amber and rust. The Whitmore estate, once steeped in silence and shadows, now pulsed with quiet purpose. Wind stirred through the trees, carrying not only the scent of hay and applewood, but also stories. Lived, survived, and shared. Clara and Lena had never set out to become stewards of a movement. They were simply trying to make sense of a legacy forged in fire and soot. But healing, like grief, rarely asks permission. It arrives quietly, demanding only presence and a willingness to stay. The Eleanor Center had expanded. What started as a rebuilt stable now stood as a sanctuary of transformation. Veterans scarred by memory, children unmoored by trauma, and caregivers burned out from endless giving came to the center not just for therapy, but to remember how to trust. Horses, the unjudging, intuitive creatures they were, bridged the chasm words could not. One crisp October morning, a group of teenagers from a nearby foster home arrived for a weekend retreat. Among them was a boy named Jonah, whose silence was louder than any scream. He refused to speak, avoided eye contact, and flinched at every sound. Clara watched him carefully, not with pity but with recognition. That was the same silence that had lived in her bones not so long ago. They didn't pressure him. Instead, she paired him with Bramble, a gentle mare who had once survived a barn fire. Slowly, over hours that passed like rain on thirsty ground, Jonah began brushing her coat, then feeding her. Then one day, as Lena watched from the fence, he whispered to Bramble. It wasn't important what he said. What mattered was that he spoke at all. Healing doesn't always look loud, Harrison had said once. Sometimes it's a breath you didn't realize you were holding. Though his steps had grown slower and his naps longer, Harrison's mind remained as sharp as ever. He spent mornings watching the sunrise from his favorite bench under the sugar maple, a flask of tea in hand. On afternoons when the breeze was right, he'd read aloud from Olivia's letters to anyone who'd listen, and even when no one did. In the evenings, Clara and Lena joined him for quiet suppers. The dining room, once echoing with loss, now held laughter, stories, and the subtle warmth of people who'd chosen each other. Harrison called it grace. Lena called it home. The sisters had launched Lantern Path, a digital platform to share their equine-assisted therapy methods, archive survivor stories, and train new generations of healers. Testimonials came in from across the globe, from rural Nebraska to Nairobi. From rural Nebraska to Nairobi. A woman in Finland wrote, "My daughter finally sleeps through the night thanks to your virtual programs." A veteran in Montana said, "The horse saved me, but so did the story of yours." Harrison watched all of this unfold from his porch with the reverence of a man who knew time was no longer his to command. His gaze followed the way Lena coaxed a stubborn gelding to trust, the way Clara led a workshop with tenderness and strength. He'd once feared the Whitmore name would die with scandal. Now it lived on, not in marble plaques, but in the steadiness of a child's breath as they let go of fear. One night, after a community storytelling circle held by lantern light, Harrison lingered in the barn. Silver Comet, older now, but still noble, stood beside him. "Remember when I nearly lost it all?" he whispered, scratching the stallion's nose. "Turns out I had to lose the lies to find the truth." He didn't come down for breakfast the next morning. Clara found him in his bed, hands folded over a journal he had kept since the night Clara and Lena first arrived. A gentle smile curved his lips, as if he had finally let go of the last question. The funeral was held under the sugar maple, where Harrison had watched so many dawns. People came from all corners of the country, not out of obligation but gratitude. Clara read a passage from one of Olivia's letters. "When the light is low and the path unclear, be the lantern, even if only for one person." From that day on, the porch light at the Whitmore house was never turned off. The lantern stayed lit, not just as a symbol of welcome but of promise, that even in a world cracked by betrayal and loss, love could still find its way home. Clara and Lena continued the work, but not alone. Evan remained a steady presence, now a counselor in training. The center grew, not in grandeur but in depth. A grove of trees was planted behind the barn, each sapling representing a story that had passed through their gates. Visitors still came, some carrying trauma like lead in their bones, others just seeking silence in a noisy world. And always there was a horse to listen, a lantern to guide, a family, imperfect but enduring, waiting with open arms. Because at Whitmore Hollow, healing was not a destination. It was a light you passed forward. Snow blanketed the Whitmore estate once again, muffling the world in a hush that seemed to hold its breath. Lena stood at the window of the Eleanor Center for Equine Healing, watching Nora, the newest arrival, walk the paddock in borrowed boots and an oversized coat. She was 16, wiry and jumpy, with eyes that darted like a rabbit's, always alert for danger. But this morning, under the pale glow of dawn and the watchful eyes of Silver Comet, she looked almost calm. Clara joined Lena, handing her a mug of coffee. She slept through the night. Lena accepted the mug with a nod. "First time in weeks," she said. They stood in silence, sipping, watching. Silver Comet nudged Nora's shoulder gently, and the girl didn't flinch. "He's picking up on something," Clara murmured. "He always does." It had been nearly a decade since they themselves had arrived on that very porch, soaked and silent clutching nothing but secrets and each other. Harrison had let them in with no questions, only a blanket and a bowl of soup. And later, with trust and truth, he'd given them something more powerful, the right to stay. Now it was their turn. Later that afternoon, Lena found Nora in the hayloft, curled into the corner, her back against the old wood wall. The smell of cedar and old memories filled the air. "You know," Lena said, sitting cross-legged nearby, "this used to be where I came when the world felt too loud." Nora didn't look up. "I wasn't hiding." Lena smiled. "Neither was I." They sat in silence. A bird sang from the eaves. "Do you know how to ride?" Lena asked eventually. Nora shrugged. "I watched a show once." "The horse died?" Lena chuckled softly. "Well, none of ours planned to." "They're stubborn like that." "Want to meet Willow? She's the gentlest one we have." Nora looked at her, eyes narrowed. "Why are you being nice to me?" "Because someone once was to me, and it saved my life." The next morning, Nora stood hesitantly outside Willow's stall. Clara was brushing the mare, humming under her breath. "Go ahead," Clara said without looking up. "She's been waiting." Nora stepped inside. Willow turned, blinking slow eyes, and lowered her head. Nora reached out and touched the soft nose, with the kind of care people often reserved for old books and broken things. By the end of the week, Nora was sweeping the barn floor before anyone asked. By the end of the month, she knew each horse's favorite treat and could name every tool in the tack room. One night over dinner, she asked, "Is it true your dad ran away with a circus?" Clara nearly choked on her soup. "No," she laughed. "That was just a rumor Harrison used to tell when we got too serious." "What was he really like?" Nora asked, her voice softer now, more open. Lena looked at the photograph over the fireplace, Harrison holding a newborn foal. His eyes crinkled with a smile that had taken years to return. He was the kind of man who left the porch light on, just in case. Spring came late that year. The thaw brought muddy boots, fresh hay, and the sound of hammering. Nora had taken it upon herself to repair the sagging fence near the east paddock. She worked with a quiet determination, as though each nail she hammered down kept her own fears from rising. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, she found Lena in the barn, cleaning old saddles. "Can I ask you something?" Lena looked up. "Anything? How did you know you were safe here? Really safe?" Lena took her time before answering. She set down the cloth, leaned back against the stall, and folded her arms. "The first time I laughed, really laughed. It was months after we arrived. Clara had tripped over a bucket, and we all ended up soaked in soapy water. Harrison just sat there laughing until he cried. And I remember thinking, maybe not everything in the world wants to hurt me. Maybe some things just want to hold me up." Nora didn't say anything, but her lips tugged upward just a little. That night, she left a note outside Lena's room. "Thank you for not asking why I came, just for letting me stay." Beneath it, a drawing, a horse, a fence, and a light in the barn window. Years would pass, as they always do. Nora would grow, and so would the Whitmore legacy. The Eleanor Center would open 2 more branches, one in Montana, another in Vermont. Veterans and children, widows and wanderers, found healing in the quiet rhythm of care. Lena would go on to speak at conferences. Clara would publish a book about equine therapy and recovery, but it was Nora, young, brash and brave, who would later take over the original center, never forgetting the night she was invited in from the cold. And the porch light, it stayed on, always. By late autumn, the golden hues of the Whitmore estate faded into a soft, contemplative gray. The trees stood bare and patient, The horses moved slower, their breath curling into the crisp morning air. Life hadn't stilled. It had quieted, softened into something deeply human. Clara and Lena had learned to embrace this season. They no longer rushed to fill the silence, because they'd come to understand that some healing doesn't arrive with thunder or fire. Some healing slips in gently, like frost on a window pane. Inside the Eleanor Center for Equine Healing, the halls had taken on a hush. Clients still came, veterans with folded letters in their coat pockets, children with questions in their eyes, survivors with hands that trembled at first touch. But they were received not with grand gestures, but with warm tea, steady eyes, and the unspoken promise that this place and its people had weathered worse and still stood. It was in this season that Nora, the girl who had once arrived in the snow, began to speak. She started slowly, over weeks of brushing Silver Comet's mane. One word, then another. Her voice had a tremble like wind through brittle branches, but it was her own. "He used to bring me here," Nora said one morning, her hand on the old fence. "My brother, before everything. I remember how the horses made me feel like I mattered." Lena placed her hand gently over Nora's. "You still do." That winter, Harrison's old armchair remained by the fire, unoccupied but never empty. His presence lived on in the things he had left behind. The books with folded corners, the wool blanket still smelling faintly of tobacco and cedar, the way Silver Comet always glanced toward the main house at dusk, as if expecting a quiet whistle. On Harrison's birthday, they lit a lantern and placed it in the window. No speeches, just a quiet toast. "To the man who gave us the key to this place," Clara whispered, "and the door to our own names." Eleanor, older now but walking stronger than ever, stood beside them. Her eyes, still sharp with memory, held a softened edge these days. "He'd be proud, not for what you rebuilt, but for who you became." In the early days of spring, the chapel was filled with fresh lilies and photographs. A new wall was being carved, one meant not for fame, but for quiet bravery. Names like Evelyn Carter, a child who learned to laugh again; Thomas Rivera, a vet who found peace in a horse's steady rhythm; and Harrison Whitmore, not for his fortune, but for his faith in second chances. Clara and Lena took turns adding stories to the digital archive, not statistics, but voices. They called it the living ledger. "We're not historians," Lena joked one day as she typed. "We're gardeners. We plant truth, and the truth blossoms." One afternoon, a woman arrived in a rental car with California plates. She stepped out, not with hesitation, but with reverence. Her name was Susan Morelli, a writer from Los Angeles. She had heard of the estate through a story shared at a trauma recovery conference. "I don't want to just interview you," she said to Clara. "I want to live here for a while, observe, work, clean stalls if you'll let me." They let her, and Susan, true to her word, did the work. She rose at dawn, shoveled hay, and cried silently one morning when a child clung to her after a riding session. In the evenings, she wrote. Her book, published the following year, was titled The Quiet Season. It didn't sell millions, but it didn't have to. It found the people who needed it. And that was enough. On the 10th anniversary of the Foster Whitmore Foundation, they held no gala. Instead, they opened the chapel doors to anyone who had once stepped foot on the land. Families came. Old trainers, new volunteers. Even Evan, now living quietly in a small town nearby, returned with his own son. They planted a tree, a simple sapling, next to the forest of healing stories. "It's not about beginnings or endings," Clara said, her voice low, carrying. "It's about what grows between." Lena took Nora's hand and guided her forward. Together they buried a small time capsule beneath the roots. a horsehair bracelet, a photograph of the barn in winter, and a letter addressed, "To the next one who knocks. To the next one who knocks." That night, as they stood beneath the stars, the chapel bell rang once, not as a call to prayer, but as a promise. A new season was always coming, and the estate would always be ready. Relating the story to real life, The Light from Whitmore Estate, the story of the Foster Whitmore family, is more than a series of dramatic events. It's a heartfelt mirror reflecting the journey of healing and rebirth from brokenness, something many people in today's world can see themselves in. We live in a time deeply fractured by loss, misunderstandings, and secrets that seem too heavy to forgive. But as Clara, Lena, and Harrison have shown, no truth is ever too late to face, no wound too deep to mend, and no family too fractured to be reunited by love and grace. In everyday life, many older adults live in loneliness, burdened by regrets and memories left unresolved. Like Harrison, they may have lost family, trust, or even their sense of purpose. Yet one unexpected encounter, a simple act of kindness, like opening the door to a stranger on a snowy night, can begin a journey of transformation. It's a reminder that kindness is never wasted. That light often comes from the most unexpected place. Clara and Lena's creation of the Foster Whitmore Foundation, grounded in equine therapy and compassion, carries a deeply human message. Healing is a shared journey. In today's society, where many struggle with trauma, depression, or disconnection, the bond between nature, animals, and community isn't just a supplementary therapy. It's a guiding path back to wholeness. Perhaps the most powerful lesson is how these characters courageously confronted the past instead of denying it. In a world that often favors appearances over authenticity, their story reminds us that truth, no matter how painful, is the foundation upon which real peace is built. We cannot rewrite the past, but we can choose how we live with it, and in doing so, write a new chapter, just like at Whitmore Estate, where legacy is no longer measured in land or bloodlines, but in love, forgiveness, and the enduring glow of hope. Before we go, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Are you tuning in from the heartland of America, a quiet countryside, or maybe a bustling city, dreaming of open fields? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if this story touched your heart, inspired you, or simply gave you a moment of warmth in your day, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another uplifting story like this. Thank you so much for being here. So much for being here. Support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more heartfelt stories soon. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one.